With the rise of leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the whole world assumes that Africa is moving away from democracy, or else Africa has realized that democracy doesn't work, so they're moving toward autocracy or dictatorship. Obviously, if you look at the new leaders in that region of Sahel, most of them young leaders, military leaders, were always in military fatigue. We're talking about Niger and Mali and other countries as well. Of course, of recent, I also saw Duma Boko of Botswana showing up in military fatigue and making statements such as that he admires how Ibrahim Traoré does things. But the question remains, is it the right thing that Africa is now copying countries like China and Russia? Because it seems like that is the kind of leadership that works. And it is assumed that now Africans are also cheering and loving that idea that they don't need democracy, but they'd rather have a strong man leader. I cannot speak for the rest of Africa, but I am an African. I will give my opinion. The answer is definitely no. We are not cheering up for these people because we don't want democracy now. We want a strong leader. But we need to understand one thing. Africa never had true democracy. This is what happened when the liberation struggles were fought and the leaders of the time assumed power. They accepted the idea of democracy so that they can stay in good books with the Western countries, because the Western countries such as America and some countries in Europe were pushing for the idea that you must be democratic so that we can be able to help you with financial aid and the rest of it. But in reality, these leaders did not accept democracy. So in reality, there was never democracy in Africa. There was no really democracy in Africa. Only a few countries tried and strived to try and become democratic. Countries such as South Africa, countries such as Botswana, and Zambia in some sense. But the rest of the continent did not accept democracy. It was democracy in paper that they hold elections, but in actual fact, there was no democracy. We cannot talk about democracy when Yoweri Museveni has been a president for 40 years. That's impossible. And we cannot talk about democracy when Robert Mugabe was a president for more than 30 years. We cannot talk about democracy when Paul Biya is close to 50 years in power. There is no democracy like that. These people use force. They are always dictators this whole time. These governments in Africa were always dictators hiding behind the facade of democracy, because they steal election, they rig election, they force people to vote for them, they use intimidation and violence, they use the police and the army. We were literally forced to vote for Robert Mugabe. Everybody who has lived in Zimbabwe knows this, that there is nothing called democracy in Zimbabwe. It's not true. It's a facade. People are forced, people are beaten, people are killed because of opposing the ruling party. So this is the background that Africa is coming from. So if you see us cheering and celebrating coups and military coups happening in Africa, it doesn't mean that we are saying democracy doesn't work. We are moving towards a dictatorship. But the military coups are the only way to remove those dictators, because the ballot doesn't work, democratic processes doesn't work, they are rigged, people are forced, elections are stolen. The only big difference is the dictatorship that these young people are bringing. They have a different mindset, they are of a different generation. They understand that Africa has been disadvantaged and all these things have been happening, so they have a different mindset, so they are more focused on developing Africa. That's why people are celebrating these young people, these young dictators, because the way they are doing things is to transform Africa. Democracy as an idea or as a way of governing, there's nothing wrong with it. This is actually the best idea on paper, because obviously the people have the power, everybody is equal under the law, and the people get to choose who leads them. Unlike in a dictatorship where the people have no say whatsoever what happens in their country or what happens to them, and the rich or those who are in power are the most powerful. The law doesn't apply to them, they can do whatever they want. But on the other hand, the other problem that came with democracy in Africa is because the West, when the Westerners came to Africa and introduced democratic processes, they were not doing it in good faith. That is the problem. That is why Africans are rejecting the idea of democracy. Because when the Westerners exported democracy to us, it was a means to control us or to manipulate us. After the liberation struggle, most of the leaders that came out of those liberation movements were anti-West. They did not want the colonizers to keep on having influence in Africa, but the colonizers wanted influence still, and they wanted to keep on getting resources out of Africa. So in order for the West to keep on having influence in Africa, for them to keep on having access to Africa's natural resources, they wanted to install puppet leaders. They wanted to install leaders who allowed them to do whatever they wanted to do in order to get access to Africa's natural resources. So they brought democracy in order to challenge those leaders who were anti-West, and started supporting those leaders, uh, positioning them and putting them in power so that they can have access to Africa's natural resources. That is why Africans do not like democracy today, because with the rise of these young militant leaders who are dictators are coming in, moving those puppets off and saying, no, enough is enough. And they are closing off the door to democracy, because so that they can close off the door to that Western influence that comes with the democratic processes. You can see this all over the world. When the West is talking about pro-democracy movements in China or pro-democracy movements in Russia, they're not doing it in good faith. Their agenda is to weaken China, and their agenda is to weaken Russia, and the people have realized it, and people know it. That's why people are now rejecting the idea of democracy. But if it was in good faith, I'm sure also on the other hand, democracy would have worked just fine. If you think what I'm saying is ludicrous, look, if a dictator is pro-West, is in cahoots and agrees with the Western agenda, they do not remove him. They will actually support him. They will never talk about democracy in that country. So for example, in Ivory Coast today, in Cameroon today, Paul Biya has been a president for a very, very long time, abusing his own people, killing opposition members. But France does not say anything because he still pays his allegiance to France, so they let him be. But when Burkina Faso stands against France, they will go against him and criticize him and try to attack him because he is against them. Then they start talking about democracy. It's not about democracy, it's about Western interests. So now let's try and answer the question, should Africa move towards dictatorship or autocracy and abandon democracy? I personally don't think so. There is a great danger of running away from democracy and trying to have a dictatorship. Because remember, the examples that we are talking about of Russia and China, these leaders who are in power in these countries, they are patriotic. The agenda of Putin, from the day he assumed power in Russia, was to rebuild Russia, and he did it. He has given results that can show that after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, when Putin comes to power, he built Russia to what it is today. Same as in China, the Communist Party has built amazing, amazing change in China. But if you look at in Africa, but it is absurd for these African leaders to talk about running their countries the same as Russia, the same as China. They have been in power already for 40 years, and they did fuck all. What they did was destroying the countries. So I do not see it as a viable solution. We can talk about Ibrahim Traoré and a few leaders in the Sahel who are doing it differently, but I don't think anything will ever happen in the rest of Africa if you follow that direction, because they have been in power already. These dictators, they have been dictators. Mugabe was a dictator and he was in power for more than 30 years. What did he do? Nothing. He destroyed the country. So I do not think it's a good idea. I think we should try to move towards democracy and have real and genuine democracy.